Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Public Affairs Series event of 2020. My name is Shannon Watson. I'm the Director of Public Affairs for the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce. This should have been our third event of the year, but as the theme of 2020 may as well be things changed, that event was postponed. So here we are together in a webinar instead of together in an event space as we normally would be. A lot of things have changed since the start of 2020. And one of the more significant ones, even if it's not as headline grabbing today, is the state of our state budget. Let's just say it's not strong, or at least not as strong as the future we were looking forward to way back when the February forecast came out. Our state budget affects every one of us. We pay in with taxes and fees, and the state delivers services from education to healthcare, to transit and transportation, to public safety, to parks and public spaces, and support to local governments. It's a complicated issue with massive implications for the business community, which is exactly why we have assembled this panel of experts. It probably wouldn't be polite to do the math, but trust me when I say we easily have decades and decades worth of experience represented. They've been there, they've done that, and they can tell us about it. The reason we're able to be here is because of our sponsors, and I would be remiss to start without thanking them first. Our presenting sponsors are Civic Eagle, Goff Public, and the University of St. Thomas. Our corporate sponsors are Comcast, Mystic Lake Casino and Hotel, Securian Financial, and WSB. Our contributing sponsors are AT&T, Clearway, Minnesota, Delwood Gardens, Evergreen Energy, Messerly Kramer, Mille Lacs Corporate Ventures, Minnesota Public Radio, and Platinum Bank. This is where I would normally ask you to join me in giving our sponsors a round of applause, so let's do that anyway. Yay, sponsors, thank you. Now I would like to introduce Elizabeth Emerson from Goff Public to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And I will just underline what Shannon said. There's some I'll even throw Tom Hanson in here, but there's kind of a lineup of sheroes coming up, and certainly folks that have their pulse on where we're going as a state. As Shannon mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Emerson. I am the Vice President of Government Relations at Goff Public here in the heart of St. Paul. So I will start, and we'll start with Senator Dick Cohen, who I'm not sure is able to join us or is going to be joining us, but Senator Dick Cohen was first elected to the Minnesota legislature in 1976. He was a member of the Minnesota House until 1987 when he was elected to the Senate. Cohen was the chair of the Senate Finance Committee from 2003 to 2011 and chair of the Senate State Government Finance Committee from 1997 to 2001. Senator Cohen earned his BA from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and his JD here in St. Paul from William Mitchell College of Law. Our second speaker is Mr. Tom Hanson. Hanson was the commissioner of, we're going to Lynn Chesky, sorry. Hanson, sorry about that. Tom Hanson was commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget during the Pawlenty administration. Prior to that appointment, Tom spent 4 years as the governor's deputy chief of staff. He also spent 4 years as the legislative director to then Speaker of the House, Steve Sviggum. He currently serves clients as part of the Legislative and Regulatory Practice Group at Winthrop and Weinstein. Mr. Hanson has a BA in History and Business Administration from Concordia College and his JD from George Mason University School of Law. Next up, we have Dr. Laura Kolumbakidis. She is Minnesota's state economist and the head of economic analysis at Minnesota Management and Budget. The economic analysis team forecasts Minnesota's economic activity and tax revenue for the governor and legislature and serves as a resource for all Minnesotans on topics related to the Minnesota economy and state revenue forecasts. She also teaches economics and public sector finance at the University of Minnesota, where her areas of interest include economics of public services, public finance, and regional economics. And finally on our panel, we have Lynn Chesky. Highly regarded as a leader in Minnesota politics for more than 20 years, Lynn Chesky served in the Minnesota House of Representatives from 1999 to 2015 and chaired the House Tax Committee. Before she was elected to the legislature, Lynn Chesky served on the Bloomington City Council, and she currently works in government relations for Lockridge Grindle Nowen. Ms. Lynn Chesky is a graduate of the College of St. Benedict and completed her graduate work at the Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And last but not least, our moderator. Our moderator is Mary Lahammer, who has been a program host and political reporter for Twin Cities Public Television since 1998. She has won several Emmys and numerous other awards in several states for her anchoring, reporting, producing, and photography. Lahammer was one of the best Capitol reporters, was named one of the best Capitol reporters in America by the Washington Post, best TV reporter by Minnesota Monthly, and best newscaster by City Pages magazine. Prior to returning to TPT, where she interned during college, she was an anchor reporter for an ABC station in Wisconsin and NBC in North Dakota. Neither of those experiences we will hold against her. Mary is a native Minnesotan who began attending the University of Minnesota's Honors College at age 15, where she went on to graduate with Phi Beta Kappa and Summa Cum Laude honors. She holds degrees in journalism and mass communications and constitutional law history from the U of M. Let's join me in giving our panelists a big welcome.
Okay, I think we're going to start with our state economist, who has some slides to sort of give us an overview of where we're at and where we're going. So, Dr. Laura, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to start by presenting the U.S. outlook and how it changed dramatically since we released our February forecast. And I'll move to Minnesota's economy, present our new revenue projections, and make some points about the differential impacts of the current economic downturn. So if you turn to the next slide. As you all know, the outbreak of COVID-19 and the measures taken to prevent its spread dramatically weakened the U.S. outlook, the outlook for U.S. growth since we released our February forecast. So what I'm showing you here is a projection by IHS Markit, which is Minnesota's macroeconomic consulting firm. In April, which is the forecast that governed our May interim budget projection, IHS was forecasting a three-quarter recession, resulting in a 5.4% decline in real GDP in 2020. In contrast, in February, they had forecast 2.1% growth for this year. And since April, I'm going to focus on April because that's their outlook that influenced what we produced. But since April, their outlook for U.S. growth has further worsened. So they now expect an 8.1% decline as of their June outlook. They produce monthly forecasts for us. So this first chart shows the level of real GDP. The solid line shows the history and that April outlook by IHS. The dotted line shows the February outlook, so the path that we thought we were on when we produced our February forecast. In the dramatic dip in the solid line, you can see those 3 quarters of declining GDP this year. IHS notes that, they noted at the time, and they continue to note, that their outlook depends critically on the path of the pandemic. So they expected the spread of COVID-19 to peak and then dissipate in the second calendar quarter of this year. So now is the time when they were expecting the disease to, the spread to dissipate, allowing social distancing restrictions to be lifted during the third quarter, so late summer or early fall. And economic recovery then begins and real GDP growth turns positive at the end of the year or toward the end of the year in their April outlook. And so in that outlook, real GDP growth in 2021 was forecast at 6.3%. So they did expect and still do expect economic growth to turn positive in the last quarter and then be positive for the entirety of 21. So you can see from the graph that IHS expects real GDP to reach its pre-pandemic level in mid-21. But within our projection horizon, GDP does not get back to where it would have been without the pandemic. We never get back to that dotted line, and that means that some amount of economic activity is simply lost. Moving to the next slide, I want to talk a bit about consumer spending. Consumer spending accounts for about 2/3 of real GDP. And so it has been important, it is important in the measure of GDP, but it's also been important during the economic expansion, that record length expansion that just ended, because consumer spending has been consistent and has grown throughout that expansion at times when other components of GDP have fluctuated. So the consumers were the engine of that long economic expansion. It also matters for our revenue forecast because it directly affects the sales tax forecast. But consumer spending was hit hard by the pandemic crisis. We had, of course, temporary business closures, social distancing measures, volatile financial markets, which affect consumers' tendency to spend, rising unemployment, and declining wage income. And all of those things contributed to a forecast 5.5% decline in real consumer spending for this year. And that's compared to, in February, 2.6% growth. And that also is lower now in their June outlook. They have that at minus 8.6%. So the shock to the US economy from this pandemic is unprecedented, both in its severity and in its suddenness. And the economic outlook is exceptionally uncertain and volatile, as you can see from the changes in the outlook over the months since we released our forecast. Economic outcomes will depend critically on the pandemic's course, the prospects for an effective treatment and vaccine, government restrictions on economic activity, consumers and businesses' responses to the lifting of those restrictions, and the impact of fiscal and monetary policies. So the US economic outlook will remain uncertain for some time, and Minnesota's outlook remains uncertain for at least as long as the US outlook remains uncertain. Moving to Minnesota, Minnesota entered the crisis in quite good condition. Our labor market was strong. We had high demand for labor, low unemployment, but we had job growth that had slowed to below the rate of US job growth, primarily because of limited labor supply. The disease outbreak and the restrictions applied to slow its spread, and the US and global economic contractions generated conditions that, again, will remain volatile for as long as the pandemic persists and as long as the US outlook remains uncertain. So most of our official economic data lag what we observe in our daily lives in the economy. So it's difficult to precisely measure how the pandemic has impacted the state economy. But one frequently published piece of information is initial claims for unemployment insurance benefits. And that's what we're looking at in this chart. So if you start actually looking at the blue line, what we have across the horizon is, across the horizontal axis, is the number of weeks since the start of the year. And the blue line shows the number of unemployment insurance claims per week of the year in 2019, so last year. So you can see that it's fairly low and pretty steady with a little bit of fluctuation. Then look at the yellow line, which is the same number, the number of unemployment insurance claims in Minnesota from the beginning of the year for 2009, so during the Great Recession. You can see that it's higher than the blue line, showing similar fluctuation and patterns. Now look at the orange line, or the green line, I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess the colors are a little bit different here, but the orange line, I think, on your screen is the 2020 line. And that followed, this is for 2020, following the same weeks of the year, and that tracked very closely 2019. So at the beginning of this year, we were looking at unemployment insurance claims that were very similar to last year, and last year we had very low unemployment in Minnesota. And then you hit the middle of March, and you see that dramatic spike in unemployment insurance claims. That first high number is 115,000. Applications for unemployment. That is when those the restrictions went into place. And we put the recession number, the 2009 line in there so you can see just how unprecedented and bizarre that number is. And then the next couple of weeks saw very high claims as well. It has since come down, not quite to normal levels, but it has since come down. But it gives you an idea, a sense of just how dramatic and sudden and quick this change was. So moving on to our budget projection, in May, we released an interim budget projection. By statute, we produce a forecast twice a year in November and February. And it is very unusual for us to release a projection any other time. But these extraordinary circumstances required this update so that policymakers could make decisions about the use of resources. And we released it at the beginning of May, informed by the macroeconomic forecast that was released at the beginning of April. It's a projection, it's not a full forecast because it's limited to the current biennium, so 2021. So fiscal year 20 is about to end and we're going to soon be in fiscal year 21. We updated major revenues and selected expenditures. I'll focus on the revenue side because that's the responsibility of my office. But the punchline, the bottom line here is that what had been a $1.5 billion projected forecast surplus for the current biennium in February flipped to a $2.426 billion projected deficit for the current biennium. That, let's all keep in mind, is before use of our budget reserve, which is at $2.359 billion. The projected deficit is the result of changes in both expected spending and expected revenues. I'm going to focus on the revenue side. And so let's turn to the next slide where I give some details on projected revenues. So in our May projection, total general fund revenues for the current biennium are now projected to be $3.611 billion less than that February forecast. And the estimates for all of the major tax types have been reduced. Individual income tax receipts are now projected to be $1.659 billion less than the February forecast. And that decrease is due to a projected decline in wage income, which results from that increase in unemployment, as well as declines in non-wage income, such as capital gains and business income, both of which are correlated with the stock market, related to the stock market. Sales tax revenue is now projected to be $1.351 billion less than the prior forecast, and that's consistent with that really dramatic change in the projection for consumer spending that I mentioned earlier. And then the corporate tax is projected to generate $404 million less than the prior forecast based on a lower forecast for corporate profits. So moving to the next slide, let me reiterate some of the many risks in this forecast. So related to the path of the pandemic is the path of consumer and business confidence. Businesses that were temporarily closed due to social distancing measures or that have seen declines in revenues are determining if they have the means to survive long enough to reopen. And many of them are reopening, but they're reopening under conditions that increase their costs. And so they have to adjust their business models. And we have yet to see if those new adjusted business models are enough, or make enough money for people to stay open. Consumers need the means and the trust in public safety to get back to spending, and so that remains a risk. Increased financial market volatility can hinder consumer spending by lowering household wealth. The impact of federal fiscal and monetary policy is uncertain. Everything that we knew about fiscal and monetary policy is incorporated into this forecast, but it's uncertain what the impact is, and it's uncertain what's going to come next in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, including uncertainty about additional federal financial support to state and local governments. We've had delays in tax payments in Minnesota to try to help people who have been affected by the pandemic. And so those delays in tax payments also delay signals about the impact of the economy on revenues, signals that we normally use when we project revenues. And so the revenue picture is not going to be clearer for us until later in the summer. And then finally, we're well out from the end of this biennium. So whenever you're projecting a year out, even under normal conditions, that comes with some risk. I'll close with a quick point about the differential impacts of this economic downturn. So on the next slide is a quote from Federal Reserve Board Chairman Jerome Powell, that while everyone is affected, every industry, every household has been affected by this pandemic, We have not all been affected the same way. So the burden has fallen most heavily on those least able to bear it, which is often the case with economic changes, but is particularly the case this time. So on the next slide, I give an example of this impact across occupations. So we sorted Minnesota initial unemployment insurance claims, so that colored line graph I showed you earlier, since mid-March by occupation. And in this chart, the height of the bar is the number of claims by people in that occupation since mid-March. And while the impact is certainly widespread, I mean, you can see how widespread it is. We do have significant impacts in healthcare, for instance, and construction and production and management and transportation. The largest impact has been in food preparation and serving related occupations and sales and related occupations. Moving to the next slide, what we did with that information was we looked at the median hourly average wages or median hourly wages in each of those affected occupations, and we ranked them from lowest to highest. And so it turns out that 37% of unemployment insurance claims in Minnesota since March 16th, since mid-March, have been from people in the lowest earning quintile. And then the two lowest quintiles account for about 60% of those applications. And this downturn has had a sudden dramatic effect on, differentially, on lower wage earners. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I'll stop here and let the panel take over, but I am available to answer questions.
All right, fantastic. I'm going to hand the baton to Mary to moderate the panel.
All right. I think I actually just want to go back to Laura right away, because she touched on some things I thought were really interesting, especially in light of the last budget forecast. And, you know, many have said we're in two pandemics. So first we had COVID, and now we have the civil unrest and the racial inequities. And it seems like those last two slides hit home those inequities more than anything, that those who can least afford this economic crisis are being hit the hardest. Can you talk to us about how the budget will be impacted as well in light of those least being able to afford it being hit, businesses and consumers? You know, some businesses had to close during some of the protests. Some of the businesses may never come back in, what that did to consumer confidence. That seems to be another shoe that could drop on this budget, right?
Yes, for sure. It really has been quite an extraordinarily difficult year. And the civil unrest and, of course, the racial disparities, by definition, have differential impacts. If you think about the jobs that are in you know, food and serving related and sales, and think about personal care work in the healthcare area, those are disproportionately women and disproportionately people of color and disproportionately young people. And so all of those people have been affected by the pandemic, the economic downturn, and particularly with BIPOC and people of color, they have been significantly affected by the civil unrest, and of course have been affected all along by the racial disparities. So from a social standpoint and from a community standpoint, we have been, the people who have been least able to bear this have been having to bear it in waves, just waves of misfortune. And from a technical standpoint, from us in doing our forecasting work, the economic downturn resulting from the pandemic is something that is unforeseen and unheard of. We've never seen this before. And our economic models are actually poorly suited for examining this. And one of the reasons it's poorly suited is because of the disparities among people of different income levels. So trying to figure out what happens to growth in total wages when our models aren't good at looking at differential impacts at the top of the income distribution versus the bottom. So I guess for the budget, what it means is that it adds uncertainty to our forecast because our forecasting abilities are not, we're trying to keep up. We're trying to keep up with these changes, and so it adds uncertainty and it adds volatility to the budget situation. And so things are going to keep changing for us, and we're going to have to be flexible throughout this biennium and the next, because economic conditions are going to change and our ability to measure them are going to change.
Let's head to a former budget commissioner, Tom Hanson. Tom, I bet you're really glad you are former at this point. I mean, how as a budget commissioner could you handle advising policy when we have waves and waves of pandemics and inequities here? What would your advice be?
Well, thank you, Mary. Yeah, I am fortunate that I'm not in office right now, but there's a couple of comments I want to make. First, if this is going to happen, ideally it happens, towards the beginning of a biennium, which then gives decision makers a chance to change the budget. And in this case, we are 14 months left in the biennium. When the pandemic hit, we were only about 8 to 9 months in. So the state has a number of options available to it going forward. The other thing that I would say, Dr. Labakitis can probably verify this, but Minnesota collects revenue fairly regularly, fairly systematically throughout a biennium, but we generally, the state generally pushes up spending more towards the beginning of the biennium. So that's all to say, the longer you wait within a biennium to make your decisions, the fewer the choices are that are available to you. So by the time you get to the next legislative session, a lot of the spending will be out the door and you're not left with enough. So they would need to, if they're going to fix the current biennium, which they have to, the sooner they act, the better.
Let's go to a former lawmaker now, again, who's probably glad she's former, because we might be in special session nonstop throughout the next year to deal with just wave after wave, like we said, COVID and the inequities and the budget. And, oh yeah, they're trying to still get a bonding bill done right now. So, Ann, take us through the legislative response and what the appropriate role is for the legislature in reacting here.
Well, thank you for having me, and I do not have the best reception, so I might lose everyone. I think the elections are going to have a lot to say about what happens. Unfortunately, politics, and I mean small p politics, will, I think, really walk us through next year, depending on, who's in the majority. And I think Tom and I can, having done this together, it doesn't really matter what party you're in. One team is really not willing to raise revenue to solve a deficit, and the other team is really not willing to cut. And so you have two teams who just do not want to do these things that they're going to have to do. And so they usually go to shifts. And we can talk about them pejoratively, that they're gimmicks and they're bad ideas, but they really save the Minnesota legislature and governors of all parties from having to hurt people who are already hurting, as the state economist just walked through, taking away services they need. So that team tends to like to do a little shifts, and they really prevent you from raising taxes. So I think what we'll see first is legislators say they will not do any shifts, and then both teams will do shifts, because it's a very difficult thing to do, is to take services away from people who need them or to raise taxes. The St. Paul Chamber knows businesses are hurting so badly, people don't want to raise taxes on them. So I think what we'll see is a lot of positioning as we wait for the February forecast. Tom's right, the longer they wait, the harder it'll be. And we're lucky, as you know, Mary, better than anyone, that we live in a state that requires a balanced budget. If we didn't have that, legislators would not get their work done until they who knows when. So that balanced budget requirement is really going to help us all next session in 2021 to solve the problems that come forward as the state economist has laid out for us.
Tom, can you jump back in on shifts and the inevitability of that being the most palatable way in divided government to balance a budget?
Well, Ann, thank you. I mean, I would have swore you and I spoke this morning and came up with that answer. I think that the first thing that'll probably happen is the state will, decide budget reserve, spend that down. And but even before they do that, like we did in 2009, you try to use as much federal money as possible. In this case, they, justifying expenses for the COVID-19 outbreak. So then, and I think if you do that, the deficit was 2.4, and you probably using federal money, probably get that down south of 2 billion. So you can actually, then you get to the budget reserve. And the reason I think they're going to go to the budget reserve is we're only 4 or 5 months from the election. And you're not going to get, as I said, you're not going to get Republicans to vote for a tax increase. And you're not going to get Democrats to cut spending without some sort of revenue increase. So they're naturally going to probably go to the shift, or not the shift, but the budget reserve. And then if it gets worse, then they would have to shift. But I'm hoping that that it's, we have enough of the budget reserve to get through this biennium. The problem with the budget reserve or the K-12 shift that Ann was talking about is it fixes it now. It's money that's available in the current biennium. It fixes it, but it doesn't. The deficit then just, reappears in the out biennium. And the other thing that Dr. Kalabakitis said that May budget forecast was rare. I don't ever remember them doing it. I think you have to go back to the early 80s, and the state purposefully went away from doing that because they're hard. The more you do, the harder it is to come up with data. But in that case, they didn't do the out biennium, so we don't know. I mean, the only indication we have is the dotted line and the darker line on the one chart shows that we're not going to catch up in revenue. So we're going to be a little short going forward. So I guess a long-winded answer.
Yeah, no, but let's bring the state economists back in and let's talk about those two solutions being talked about, budget reserves. Talk to us again about the reserves, whether they can all be unloaded in one chunk or bit by bit, and then budget shifts, because it seems like both are going to be a real possibility.
Yeah, so thanks. I want to emphasize a couple of principles here. One that Tom mentioned that's super important is keeping in mind that out biennium. So we did not forecast the out biennium in this interim May budget projection because there simply is not enough data to do that. But we did make a statement that the impact of this crisis is going to be negative on the next biennium, and it's going to be large. So you can solve the problem now, but the problem is just as big. We don't know how big it's going to be, but we are going to have a problem in the next biennium. So so think about the 3 years out and maintain some flexibility, because the economic conditions are going to change and the revenue conditions are going to change. And so both of those solutions, using shifts and using the budget reserve, maintain some flexibility. If shifts are, I'm not the expert on legislative process or even the budgetary process, but I think a shift is more easily undone than a budget cut would be or a tax increase would be. So that's something that maintains some flexibility. With regard to the budget reserve, using it all at once to solve this problem now may seem painless, but it will not be painless when we get to February, as Ann said, and we have to solve the budget problem for the rest of the biennium. And both of their points about, the sooner you solve this problem, the better, because it will get harder the further out you get and more that money is spent.
Ann, can you jump in and talk about that? If the easy way out is grabbing all those budget reserves, what the impact that has legislatively, politically, societally? Could you hear us, Lynn Chesky? I don't know if she's breaking up on us.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yep, we've got you. Did you hear the
Yeah, I
question?
think I'm breaking up.
Okay. You want to
Sorry.
try? No, it's okay. You could hear the question though. Do you want to try and talk about the impact if we use up all the budget reserves? Oh, I think we've really lost her. Oh, now she's back.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
Um,
You look better now. Okay, so did you hear kind of the lead up talking about the danger of using, if we use the entire budget reserves?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge danger because we have to manage the cash flow over a couple of years. Senator Cohen, who has not joined on yet, Senator Cohen and Senator Skoye on the Senate side, along with me on the House side, put in that thing we have in law now that automatically fills up the budget reserve when there's a surplus. And, you know, we're in the best position because of that auto filler, but you can see it's already gone. And I hope Tom's right that all the federal money will cover it. But we can't take all that at once. I wouldn't advise anybody in either party to do that. There are too many unforeseen things coming. What if there's another strong surge in COVID? What if the hospitals need a lot more help? You know, who could have predicted the killing of George Floyd? And now, just yesterday, the Minnesota House asked for $300 million to help rebuild those businesses. So we can't put ourselves in that position, and legislators are going to have to make some really difficult decisions on both sides of the aisle.
So Tom, that sounds like what you put forward before, that it's shifts temporarily and maybe some cuts and tax increases in a new legislature, so that this election matters, right?
Well, I think the election, yeah, it matters. If you get the DFL in control of all chambers, like I think when Representative Lynn Chesky was in 2013 and 14, they raised the state income tax and other taxes. If you get the House or the Senate that's a Republican, then they're more likely to have to negotiate a solution. And Republicans don't raise revenues. And so then that's why you always get to, and when we talk about shifts, it's basically just taking spending in the current biennium and bumping it into the next. I mean, it isn't anything more fancy than that. The primary way the state does it is the K-12 shift, but there's other ways that they do that as well. And the statute only requires you at the end of the biennium, at the stroke of midnight, on the end of June going into July, that it be balanced, and then you can be out of balance the whole of the next 2 years if you want. And ultimately, it was good that Ann and others put that building back of the cash flow in the budget reserve, because at the end of in 2010, you know, we got so low, you know, because we didn't have a budget reserve or cash flow, that we had to really scramble to, you know, for cash flow on a week-to-week basis. So, but back to your original question, I think that my hope would be the state gets through this biennium, at least till the election, with the budget reserve, and maybe do some things after that and carry some of the budget reserve into the next biennium.
Dr. Kolomakidis, I'm still struck by a couple of those charts, though, where the dotted line never meets the solid line again. And that means our revenues will not return to the budgeted, the forecasted revenue. So to me, that means there has to be a permanent solution aside from shifts. That means either more revenue has to come in or spending has to be cut to get those lines together and to get to our constitutionally balanced budget, right?
Yeah, that's probably going to be true. You can't draw a direct, a direct connection between the charts that I showed you on U.S. real GDP to Minnesota's tax revenues. There's a lot of correlations of various types between here and there, but generally that's right. That when we have an economic downturn and revenues fall, and think about total wages in the state fall, even if we start growing at the same rate we were growing before, we're below that path that we thought we had been on. And so even if growth comes back, we will need we've got a problem to solve. And fortunately, Minnesota has a lot of tools at our disposal to solve that problem. The budget reserve being an important one. I mean, the state did what has been recommended to do, which is when revenues float with the economy, for instance, the income tax going up when the economy goes up, taking forecast surpluses and putting them into the budget reserve and saving them for a rainy day is precisely what gets recommended, because this all illustrates the cruel irony of the impact of the business cycle on state government. Since, as others have said, state government, we have to balance the budget. In a downturn, we both lose revenues and demand for services goes up because people are lower income. We have the extraordinary situation of social unrest as well. So demand for services goes up at a time when our resources go down. So the solution to that is build that reserve when you have the money, so you can spend it when you don't, in order to maintain those services that Minnesotans need.
I guess to follow up too, I'm also struck by the unknowns. I've watched a lot of budget forecasts over the last couple of decades, and I don't know if I've ever seen that many bullet points on a slide of unknowns. Isn't that true that this is unprecedented in terms of maybe even confidence in the forecast with so many unknowns?
Yeah, I usually try to keep it to 4 or 5 points, and we just had to keep adding on. I'm confident that we are projecting as best we possibly can, given the information we have. So in terms of confidence in the forecast, this is as good a forecast as it gets, given the uncertainty. But we are facing layers and layers of uncertainty that we normally don't. I mean, it's almost charming how I talked about uncertainty in forecasts 3 years ago, given the situation we have now. So the global outlook is volatile. The U.S. outlook is volatile. We have to make this forecast with a lot less information than we normally have, because we have delays in payments. So that's a big unknown. We aren't going to know until, for example, we aren't going to know until later this summer what income tax liability was last year. And normally we would have had that information in April of this year, but we had those payment delays. So this is why I'm emphasizing flexibility, because we're on a rocky path, and things are going to keep changing. And we will be as transparent as we possibly can about what we know and what we don't know, so that policymakers can hedge their bets about what might be coming down the path.
Let me go further down that line of unprecedented and go to Tom and Ann. Let's start with you, Tom, because I remember someone you worked for, Governor Tim Pawlenty, once describing a $6 billion budget shortfall as the Incredible Hulk of budget shortfall. So I was just, saying to the state economists that I've never seen so many unknowns on a forecast, but we've seen worse budget outlooks. You've seen them. How does this compare to that Incredible Hulk?
Well, then, and you're referring to end of 2008 and early 2009. Then the general fund was about 35 million, and our budget at the time, the budget deficit was 4 billion something in November, and it ballooned to 6 in February. And then we got 1.8 or so of federal money. So the amount then was larger than it was now. There may be, and I would say it was equally as cryptic, when you had some of the big Wall Street institutions going under, and people calling it, quote, the Great Recession. I think it's difficult now, but it seemed awfully huge in 2008 and 2009 when we were doing this. And at least I'm heartened by the fact that the numbers of the deficit aren't as big now, and they have a budget reserve in place, and they have paid back all of the budgetary shifts and everything. So they have a full arsenal of tools to fix this. They're in a better shape today than we were in going into 2009.
And Lynn Chesky, you were around through those years as well. So does this seem less daunting than that $6 billion shortfall? I don't know if she can hear us. I know she's having issues. Anne, could you hear us in the question?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you.
A little bit, and I'm just starting to lose you again. I was hearing it.
Okay. We were comparing the $6 billion shortfall and how this compares in either its dreadfulness or optimism. No, we'll come back to you. All right, I'll go.
Yeah, I think you're probably not going to be able to hear me.
Actually, you came through really well there. Can you hear me? Do you want to try one more time? Okay. I guess we don't have her. Okay, I'll go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you. We can be patient. No?
I have to hold up a sign with the
Yes,
question.
we can hear you. We can hear you.
For some reason.
Go ahead. If you want to try and go ahead.
Oh, hello there.
Hi.
Generally, I lose it and it comes back.
Okay,
you know, I agree with Tom. It was much worse before because there wasn't a reserve. The number was bigger. Problem is the current legislature is just in a pitch dark room and they have no idea where they're walking. None of us knows, as Dr. Kalmakita said, are they going to walk off a cliff? Are they going to, things going to get better? Nobody knows. There's just no way. What's so unique now is COVID was no one's fault. And so it's very difficult to understand our way out of this. And since the best epidemiologists don't know what's going to happen next, and infectious disease experts, I think the legislature is just completely in the dark here. And I mean, I hope we all know more by next January when they come back with a brand new legislature. But, I was lucky to serve under 5 speakers, 3 Republican speakers of the House and 2 Democratic speakers of the House. And, it was a battle. I mean, I served under Governor Ventura and Governor Pawlenty and Governor Dayton, and everything was, like a different group of people making decisions. And that's really what it is. It's personalities, it's willingness, as Mary knows, covering the legislature and knowing them all. So much of it is relationship based. So there's going to be a will and a way. If there's a will and there's a way to get out of this in the next session, and yet this session, I mean, we can see right now it's looking pretty grim. The House just left the floor. They're done on the floor for today. The Senate just came in. It's difficult to see how they'll even get done by this Friday or July 4th or whenever it's going to be. But when they really want to, they can. And so I don't have any doubt in my mind that if Senator Gazelka and Speaker Hortman and Governor Walz this year or next, or maybe new leaders, want to find their way through this, they will. It's just really a relationship-based place. And keeping those relationships strong are really important.
And while your signal's working, can you talk about, since they're in special session right now, I'm watching the Senate just came back in, do they need to keep coming back for budgetary reasons, not just policy, yet this summer and fall, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think they need to come back and vote on the governor's emergency position every 30 days. But they did do a 2-year budget, so they're okay there. It'd be great if they could pass a bonding bill. I think they all want to. And I think the part of the reason the state economist, Tom as MMB commissioner working under Pawlenty, me as a taxpayer, and everybody else, we know Senator Cohen who can't join us. The reason we all work so hard for that great rating from the bond houses is that we can have low interest debt. So, you kill yourself to get a good bond rating and run a good budget. And everybody's working on it, both elected and appointed and serving. And then if you don't do debt, I mean, kind of what was the point? Because you want that bond rating so that your people of Minnesota can buy things at a very low interest rate. So I think we all, on both sides of the aisle, wants to figure out this bonding bill. It would be great if they did it. I don't know that they will, but they don't have to. And they don't have to pass another tax bill. There's really nothing they have to do budgetarily. I think morally, emotionally, or politically, all 4 caucuses feel there's things they have to do before they can go home.
Let's go back to the state economist and talk bond rating. That was something I wanted to talk about, and the effect that draining those reserves could have, the effect of the economy, and losing businesses and civil unrest in Minnesota. Any of that have a potential effect on our bond rating?
The bond rating agencies take a holistic look at the state, and so they are evaluating our economy, and they are evaluating our governance and our governance structure, and they are evaluating our budget, how we budget, and they're evaluating our financial soundness. So we're not the only state in who's facing a downturn. All the states are, and so they tend to be more critical of something that is a state-specific impact. So if Minnesota was somehow in an economic crisis and nobody else was, then that's something that they would note. They also, they have given us credit for the budget reserve policy and for other budgeting policies we have. For instance, forecasting out to the next biennium, and often, especially in the last budget, budgeting out to the next biennium, not with an official budget, but at least having that conversation during the budget negotiations. They do expect that the point of the budget reserve is to preserve our ability to provide services during a downturn. So I don't think that the rating agencies are going to criticize states for using the tools that they have. They will watch very carefully what every state does now. And so they're going to watch the decisions that get made and watch to make sure that the decisions that are getting made are responsible, are keeping flexibility, and are maintaining financial soundness, not just for this biennium, but for the next. And so I don't think that that Minnesota is subject to criticism because we're in a downturn like everyone else, but we will be subject to criticism if we make irresponsible choices. It's not clear to me how the civil unrest is going to impact the state in terms of perceptions of the bond houses. Almost every state has had some issues, but it did start here in the Twin Cities with this particular case, and it arose because of persistent racial disparities and police brutality in Minnesota. And so it's not clear to me how that's going to enter the conversation.
Yeah, Tom, can you take that too? Because that's the harder thing to quantify is, we used to be Minnesota, the state that works, right? Wendy Anderson holding the fish up on the cover of a magazine, and remember the sub headline was that government worked here. And I think a lot of folks thought we kind of rested on our laurels, and yeah, the white community did really well in Minnesota while our disparities just towered in every measurable way of income, education, all of those. And does the rest of the nation does this affect, how people think about investing in Minnesota and bond ratings in Minnesota and corporate and diversity, and whether you can want to move and work and live in Minnesota? Because the secret's kind of out that white people do well in Minnesota, but others not so much. It's a big problem. Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody will watch and see how we respond at this moment and how the legislature and the governor are going to respond to the disparities, not just now, but going forward, the education gap and jobs and everything. They'll be looking at us. Regarding the bond rating, and I'll be a little bit of a contrarian to the. I think it's important to have a good bond rating, but not at the expense of, if you're gonna raise taxes or cut spending and harm Minnesotans so that you can have a AAA bond rating and save an increment of interest on the bond, on the bond sales. I always say it's more of a symbol of how we budget. And I found when I was commissioner, I kind of had this sense, but whether you're a Republican in our state or a Democrat or even an independent under Governor Ventura, we do a good job budgeting in the state. The fact that we budget out 4 years, you look at our debt management policies, they are extraordinary compared to other states. And all you got to do is spend a little time reading about Illinois and California, and you realize that even on our worst day, we're better than some of the things they do. But I don't think that, I mean, yes, you want to keep a good bond rating, but not at the expense of doing things that harm others.
And can you talk about that, our bond rating and just confidence in Minnesota as a society, as well as a place you want to invest and work and live and grow?
Yeah, I think we're good there. As the state economist talked about, we have a really diverse economy. The business community is quite diverse. But I agree with Tom, and what you said, Mary. I mean, the secret's out. I think it's difficult to find people who don't think that something significant has to happen after the killing of George Floyd. And it's something happens like that. It's really, how is everyone going to react together? And I think all of us have, we're all looking at ourselves and we're all looking at what we think. And there's no doubt in my mind that every legislator is thinking about this. And we all know the governor is. We're watching him lead. He's incredibly popular. But both sides of the aisle are really struggling with some of these fundamental questions. The Posse Caucus, who has been a part of my life for a long time, but for many in Minnesota, they never heard of them before. Now Minnesotans are, who's the Posse Caucus? What are they talking about? I think it's wonderful that people are actually understanding. There's a group of legislators who felt underrepresented for a really long time who found their voice, and it came in a tragic way. But I think in some way, the measure of us won't be our bond rating or our budgeting. It'll be, what do you do with the big problem that is thrust upon the Minnesota legislature, and how will they address that? Not only this special session right here now, today, as the Senate is having hearings, as the House has been having hearings, but what are they going to do after the next election? And it's going to be up and down the ballot, from the presidential race to your local legislator. It's going to have an impact, I think.
And just in case anyone on the call or who might watch this too, I'll identify the Posse Caucus as people of color and indigenous caucus. And definitely there's a caucus in the House and the Senate that's having a big impact in shaping legislation right now. One other issue we wanted to hit is local and city governments and revenues. Let's start with Dr. Kolomakidis on this. What can state government do, and what's the decision making as this trickles down now to local, city, and county budgets?
Generally, when you think about public finance in a federal system, or you have federal government, state governments, and then city and county governments, the highest level is the level that has the most opportunities for raising revenue. And so it makes sense for that level to share revenue with the next level down. And so I think there will be a role for the state to support local governments. And one way, I believe, is going to be in helping them obtain the federal money that they have coming to them. I think it has to be part of the conversation of the state resolving its budgetary challenge. Is what's the impact of the actions the state takes on the cities? Because if the cities and counties are unable to provide services in an economic downturn, that's going to negatively affect Minnesotans and negatively affect the state, and potentially increase demand for services at the state level. So I don't have the solution to that, but it has to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, Tom, there was a Republican who said maybe just local government needs to declare bankruptcy to get through this. Is it that dire that city or counties may have to declare bankruptcy to survive this?
Well, the cities and counties are subunits of the state, and ultimately the state would have to step in and help them out. I see, when I was in office and we put budgets together, and you look at the spending side of the balance sheet, you had three things in my mind that made up about 80% of the entire general fund. And the first is K-12 and higher ed, and then human services, and that's about 70%. And then the third piece was always LGA, county aids, LGA, and you have to, if you're not going to raise revenues, you're going to have to go to somehow reduce those. And we always chose to not cut K-12, and we defaulted to human services, higher ed, and LGA when we did it. And that started the discussion. I'm looking at Ann on my screen. Of she always said that when we cut LGA, and when you do cut LGA, you're really raising local property taxes. And she and I could debate that for 5 hours. But it's all to say that the state, counties and cities are subunits, subdivisions of the state, and the state would have to step in and would do it in some manner.
Yeah, and Tom just set up the question for you there of what's the effect. I mean, does this mean property taxes go up? And what about all those jurisdictions who don't have the property wealth to tax it? What do they do if the state and the Fed really don't bail out cities and counties?
Yeah, I mean, it's unacceptable for the state to not help the cities and counties. That cannot happen. I mean, the federal government having passed the CARES money on, that's not even enough. The St. Paul Chamber knows that all those local governments that are their partners are critical to their businesses as well. And those cities and counties, the money that's going to come through the feds, and the Senate's debating it right now, Senator Rosen's bill and Representative Marquardt's bill on how to distribute that money, they can only use it for COVID. They can't even use it for revenue loss. So the state's going to have to do a lot more than that. And honestly, the federal government needs to as well. Tom and I benefited, as Tom said, the $1.8 billion. I mean, the Congress was shoveling money at the states when we were going through it under Governor Pawlenty. The Congress has not nearly stepped up enough yet for local units of government. But we all know that the legislature requires that our local units of government do all kinds of things by state mandate. They have to have clean water. They have to have public safety. We expect the counties to deliver human services, so we can't leave them hanging. I know that locally elected officials across the spectrum are doing what legislators are doing. They're being cautious. They're worried. They're trying to save now. They're trying to plan, and they don't know what's coming either. But we can't push that aside. One of the other things that happens in our state aid program to local governments is we don't just provide aid, because many of us live in communities that don't receive those aids. Part of what the aid is doing is reducing disparities between, as you said, Mary, communities that have large tax bases and the ability to raise revenue with very little impact, and other communities that have almost no commercial industrial tax base. We have all kinds of complicating things that happen in the system that we won't go into. But even suburb to suburb, we have fiscal disparities, tax-based sharing. So I think it's something that the Minnesota legislature is not going to be able to ignore. I think Senator Chamberlain and Representative Marquardt are going to spend a lot of time on this next year, trying to figure out what are they going to do about all those local governments, the revenue systems, and all the state aids that get moved around in the system.
One more area to cover, and I'll go back to Tom on this one. What measures should the business and philanthropic communities be prepared for, and what is their role in moving the state forward on budget numbers and disparities and everything that we're seeing that is a drag in our society and economy right now?
Well, I think if you're the business community, you're probably looking at some sort of revenue raiser, or elimination of a tax expenditure credit of some kind. And on the nonprofit community, probably cuts in grants or cuts in human services. So I think their challenge will be to engage in the process to find ways to reform what's being done, so that it isn't just a cut and you're expected to do more, with less, but try to figure out a better way to do it, all while we're trying to solve the racial inequity issue that we've seen is so prevalent in our state, especially in the last few weeks.
And I wonder if we have any sense of how much money businesses just saved by everybody working from home or lost, and what that, do we have any sense of this huge impact of people working from home for several months, whether businesses will actually return to huge buildings and rents, and if they saved money or lost money? Do we have any sense of that?
I don't know. Dr. Kalamakitis probably knows more than I.
Yeah. Doctor, do you have any sense of that yet from the business community? Because that's unprecedented, right?
Yeah, it is. That disruption was unprecedented. I don't think we know we know magnitude. But I think what we can say for sure is that we are not going back to normal. We're not going to go back to the way it was, and we don't know what that new normal is going to look like. I mentioned earlier that even as restrictions are being lifted and businesses are coming back or opening up, they're all opening up under a different business model than they had before. And so everyone's business model, whether you're a small business, a large business, or a nonprofit, or a government agency, your business model has been disrupted. You think about, dentist offices opened up. I went to the dentist, and they have all manner of steps you have to go through, and only so many people in the office at a time, and the dental hygienist is in full PPE, and it takes longer with each patient. So they're seeing a smaller number of patients every day. That's costing them a lot, and that's changing their revenues, and it's changing their cost structure. And every restaurant is doing this, and every hairdresser is doing this, and every business, that every law firm is figuring this out. Like, do we pay this rent? Do we bring people back? Do we have them work remotely forever? So there may be some cost savings in the telecommuting, but I think we will also we'll learn where that tipping point is. Like, maybe not telecommuting full time is great for every business, but are we going to have people telecommute more than they did before? I'm particularly concerned about businesses and nonprofits that had very low margins to begin with. Arts organizations, what is that business model going to look like? So I don't think we can put numbers on most of it yet, but we can say that a year from now, things are not going to look like they did a year ago.
I'm just even wondering about commercial real estate. If no company goes back to 100% capacity, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, does that completely disrupt downtowns, any large corporate structures? That's a lot of real estate.
Yeah.
Will we be able to measure that?
I don't know. I don't know that we can envision what it's really going to look like. It's not just a decision between, do we let everybody telecommute, or do we bring everybody back to the office? But even if we bring everybody back to the offices are not going to look like they did before, because we have new health restrictions. So there's no doubt that the commercial real estate industry is being disrupted. I just don't know exactly what it's going to look like.
And we just have a couple minutes left. Doctor, can you just give us some markers to look for? Just give us a little roadmap on what you're going to be watching, what we should all be watching between now and kind of the next forecast. What are the best measures of how the budget's looking?
Yeah, so I talked about the volatility of the U.S. economic situation. And so I'm watching for that U.S. Economic forecast to stabilize, to settle down. And so where the forecaster's saying, okay, our forecast from last month, this month isn't going to change that much. So I'm looking for stability in the U.S. outlook, which probably won't come until we have better understanding of the course of the pandemic. I'm looking for those payment delays to play themselves all the way through, so that we're back on a regular payment schedule, so that when we look at revenues, we can make some inferences about what's going on in the economy. Right now, our revenues are not correctly reflecting what's going on in the economy. Another big mystery, or big unknown for us, is the impact of this huge spike in unemployment insurance claims on total wages. So total wages is the sum of all the payrolls in the entire state. And that's a big driver in our income tax forecast. And right now, the withholding of taxes on income, that has not fallen as much as you would expect, given that spike in unemployment insurance claims. So we need some time to see that spike in unemployment insurance claims to play its way through to the unemployment rate, and to play its way through to income tax withholding, so that we are better able to forecast withholding. So, for the inside players, watch our monthly and quarterly revenue updates. Every month we release revenue information to see how those revenues are are holding up relative to our new projection, and look at our quarterly updates, and we'll say what we can about what's going on with the economic outlook and the revenue story.
We'll be watching. Thanks so much, all of you, Laura, Tom, and Anna. Send it back to Shannon.
Awesome. Thanks, Mary. I'd like to thank you for doing an excellent job moderating this conversation, and our experts. I know that the experience that you bring to this conversation is sort of hard fought, and so I definitely appreciate your sharing it with us today. We did record the webinar, and so even though current legislators, newer legislators are on the floor, that you might be getting some phone calls, people saying, wait a minute, what about this? Because they may need to learn a thing or two as well. So thank you again. We really appreciate that. I'd also like to thank again our Public Affairs Series sponsors. We definitely appreciate all you do to support this series and the Chamber. If you don't have anything to do next week and you like public affairs programming, we can help with that. We've got 3 events coming up Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That was sort of an accident. I didn't do that to myself on purpose. But registration for all of these events is available on our webpage. So thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.